The Atari 2600 and Nintendo Entertainment System are by far the most popular 8-bit video game consoles of all time. Both have hundreds of fun games in their libraries, and to no one's surprise, many of those games appeared on both systems. Okay, so let's take a look at these systems, starting with the 2600. It uses a modified 6502 processor called the 6507, running at 1.19 MHz. It has only 128 bytes of memory, a screen resolution of 192 by 160, and 2 channels of sound. Color is its strong suit, and it can display 128 on screen at once. A series of chips built into the cartridges allowed for games up to 32 kilobytes in size. Now, the NES also uses a modified 6502 processor running at a clock speed of 1.79 MHz. It has a whopping 2K of memory, a resolution of 256 by 240, and has 5 channels of sound. It has a palette of 52 colors and can display 25 on screen at once. It uses memory mapper chips which expand its graphical abilities, allowing for games up to 512 kilobytes in size. Clearly, the NES has a hardware advantage over the 2600. As for the design, the 2600 is a classic with that faux wood grain on the front. Oh, it's just so beautiful. That alone gives it the advantage. Of course, we did have the Vader and the 2600 Junior as well, so this is a system that's always keeping up with the times. The cartridges slot in from the top and are extremely easy to change out. As for the NES, it looks exceptionally boring. It was purposely designed not to look like any of the Atari systems. The cartridges slot in from the front and have to be pushed down. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Console design goes to the 2600. Now for the controllers. The 2600 was modeled after arcade sticks and is as simple as it gets. 8 directions and a fire button. The game select and game reset are right on the console, so that's all you need. The NES controller is just as iconic. An 8-way directional pad, 2 action buttons, select and start. More buttons means more flexibility and more complex games. Advantage NES. Of course, the NES will, in most cases, have better graphics and sounds due to its more advanced hardware. But as we know, it's the gameplay that matters the most. So with that in mind, I'm going to be comparing the earliest titles for each system to keep it fair. And then I'll decide which game I personally feel has the gameplay advantage, if any. So let's look at the games, starting with Air Raiders vs. Top Gun. A first-person jet fighter game for the Atari 2600? I thought the only jet fighter game was Combat. Anyway, don't confuse this with another game for the 2600 called Air Raid. That one is extremely rare and valuable. Air Raiders, on the other hand, is much more fun and at least $12,000 less expensive. Once you take off, which is easier said than done, you battle jets in the air. Landing is also much easier than it is in Top Gun. All you have to do is fly to 0-0 on the altimeter and wait a few seconds until the runway appears. And then pretty much all you have to do is land. Then we have Top Gun, everyone's favorite flight simulator whipping boy. Gameplay is actually pretty good here, and landing, well, it's easy enough if you know what you're doing. I tried it a bunch of times and I was never able to do it. But then suddenly, I got it! The problem is that the altitude and airspeed are connected, so the easiest thing to do is to drop your airspeed to about 300 and then keep aiming upwards and speeding up if you drop below 200 feet. It's definitely tricky, and I can understand the AVGN's frustration. Stage 2 is more of the same action, but now you've got to battle ships too. And don't get me started with that in-air refueling sequence. Yikes. In both games, you're flying and shooting enemies. The NES game has some really frustrating elements that make you want to throw the controller, where the Atari game is just basic shooting fun. This one is a tie. Bump and jump. Drive your buggy and crash into as many enemy cars as possible. Or are they enemies? I mean, I guess they could just be soccer moms taking their kids to soccer practice. Really, all you have to do is jump over those open areas in the road and avoid crashing. I've only ever played the home ports of this game, and the 2600 version is pretty good. There's a lot of sprites on the screen, which is pretty incredible for the system. It's one of those few Atari games that has an actual background instead of black outer space. And surprisingly, the music is pretty good too. Let's take a look at the Nintendo version. The gameplay, of course, is basically the same. You have to bump these cars into the sides and avoid crashing yourself. Interestingly enough, I'm only noticing no more than 5 enemy cars on screen, just like the 2600 version. Both of these games are fun, and there's really no gameplay advantage for either of them. BurgerTime. Now, if you watched my channel before, you know that BurgerTime is one of my favorite games, and I find myself talking about it a lot. It's such a crazy concept. I mean, walking over lettuce and patties and buns to make the perfect burger? Weird. The Atari version looks very minimalistic, but it actually retains much of the gameplay elements of the original. The enemy AI is just as erratic, but I noticed there's a new enemy, the French fry, I think. Maybe? I mean, it's just a stick. Also, the eggs are just squares. Well, anyway, Peter Pepper still moves around the game at a brisk pace and can collect bonus peppers to stun the enemies. Oh, and there's at least 3 different stages, too. The same could be said about the Nintendo version, but with better graphics and sounds. The buns look like buns, the lettuce looks like lettuce, and the patties look like, there's something growing on them. Ugh. What I love about this game is that you can't take a regular path. You have to be more strategic in order to fool your enemies. But like any good version of BurgerTime, you can drop your enemies down to the bottom of the stage for big points. So the 2600 version is not terrible in the gameplay department, but the graphics and speed and smoother controls of the NES version give it the advantage. Commando. Now this is an Atari game that's reaching beyond its abilities. But when you think about it, Commando is really a pretty basic game. Just move upwards through the stage, shooting enemy soldiers while trying to reach the end of the stage. This is an okay version of Commando, but it's a little hampered by the fact that the 2600 only has one button. To launch grenades, you have to hold down the fire button and hope it lands where you want it to. That's a challenging aspect to the gameplay that can make it pretty tense in this version. Then we have Commando for the NES, which clearly has better graphics, but does it have better gameplay? Maybe a little bit, because you're able to launch grenades easier and move around the screen faster. Also, there's more enemies on the screen to battle, and also hidden underground areas. I'm not really sure if the 2600 version has those. It's somewhat glitchy though, so I think the programming is a little suspect. This is definitely a more accurate version of the original arcade game. I like the 2600 version for its fast and fun gameplay, but the NES version has more gameplay elements to make it fun. Defender 2. The sequel to the original Defender game was called Stargate, but the name was changed because Williams wanted to make sure they owned the trademark. But I mean, who already owned the name Stargate? A board game company? No one really knows. Anyway, this is an amazing 2600 game. Rescue the humanoids from the enemy aliens with your blaster. You also have smart bombs, hyperspace, and Inviso at your disposal, but only if you use the second joystick. Graphics are a good representation of the arcade, which isn't surprising since they're so simple. Defender 2 on Nintendo is sadly lacking. It doesn't have hyperspace or Inviso. It does have the Stargate, of course, but no hyperspace is a pretty big omission. Other than that, the gameplay is pretty fun, although these sounds are kind of rough on the ears. Initially, the graphics look pretty accurate, but I mean, the length of your laser is just too short. Both are fun games, but surprisingly, the gameplay of the 2600 version is more accurate because of the inclusion of hyperspace and Inviso. Dig Dug. One of the classic Golden Age video games has you playing as Dig Dug, ridding his garden of enemy pukas and figars. Use your pump to explode them or drop rocks on their heads. You know, it's your choice. The 2600 game plays pretty well, although Dig Dug moves a little choppily when going up and down, but, you know, side to side, it's very smooth. The Famicom game looks, sounds, and plays nearly identical to the arcade. The gameplay is a bit faster and smoother here too. No choppy up-down animation. Both of these games are really fun, and neither have a big advantage over the other in the gameplay department. You're still Dig Dug, pumping up enemies in both games. Donkey Kong. Nintendo's most famous character appears on Atari. We look back and think how weird that was, but at the time, Donkey Kong made the rounds on all the game systems. The 2600 game, created by Gary Kitchen, is an amazing feat of programming. Just think how challenging it was to make those slanted ramps. Unfortunately, the 2600 version only has 2 stages due to memory constraints. I wonder what the other 2 stages would have looked like on this system. The NES version looks and sounds almost identical to the arcade, but it only has 3 stages. Come on, Nintendo, why'd you do us dirty like that? Gameplay here is fantastic, and there's few versions that can match the smooth gameplay. As you would expect, the NES version definitely takes the crown in the graphics and sound department. But you know, both of these games are fun to play. The NES having 3 stages is what really sealed the deal though. Double Dragon. This is the classic of classics beat-em-up game. The 2600 version is, not that great. I'm sure it was developed just to capitalize on the name. A couple of years ago, I did an interview with programmer Dan Kitchen, and when I asked him about the game, he quickly switched the discussion to Kung Fu Master. I took that to mean he wasn't really thrilled with the result. Anyway, yeah, the 2600 game is extremely hard and not really that much fun. I like it for its technical marvel status, but the punching and kicking, it's just not there. Double Dragon on the Nintendo is really good though, and I don't care that it's just single player or is limited to 2 enemies on the screen at once. It's still a lot of fun to play. It has really smooth action and great gameplay. There's lots of satisfying punches, kicks, and other bone-crunching moves that expand the depth of the game. Sure, you have to earn some of those moves, but I find it to be a clever gameplay element. So there's really no contest here. The graphics don't matter, but the gameplay does. I love the NES version and absolutely detest the 2600 game. Galaxian. This is Space Invaders with enemies that fly down to attack you. The Atari game is very fun. This version is also extremely challenging, and the enemies attack in their usual patterns. There's something really satisfying about blasting those guys too. There is a Famicom version of the game which is very close to the arcade. It looks, plays, and sounds nearly identical. Again, those annoying aliens move in the proper formations to attack you. It feels a little more methodical than the later game, but it's still very fun. This one will always live in the shadow of its little brother Galaga, but it's great fun on both the Atari and NES. Dark Chambers vs. Gauntlet. Dark Chambers is one of the earliest dungeon-crawling action games. Well, its inspiration called Dandy Dungeon for the Atari 8-bit computer was, anyway. You explore through different dungeons in search of treasure and a high score. There are different power-ups like guns and daggers and shields that increase your abilities and helps you battle the goons. If you shoot a monster, it turns into a lesser monster until it's destroyed. Yeah, it's a little bit different from Gauntlet, but the premise is basically the same. Gauntlet on the NES is almost as classic as the original arcade game. Journey through a dungeon battling goons, collecting gold and power-ups. Wait a minute, that seems kind of familiar. It's because this game was also based on Dandy Dungeon. The NES version really expands on that original arcade game, and from what some of you have said, it's a combination of both Gauntlet arcade games. Dark Chambers is a fun dungeon-crawling action game, but the gameplay is limited where the NES offering expands on the standard game, making it much improved. Football vs. 10-Yard Fight. It's the battle of the crappy football games. The Atari 2600 game is about as basic as it gets. In the Atari game, you can actually select your offensive and defensive plays by pressing a direction on your joystick. That's easy enough, but unless you have the manual, you have no idea what play you're choosing. Also, this is a two-player only game, so it's not much fun when you're playing by yourself. But I did try here, and I gotta say, it's kind of tricky keeping track of both teams. I really wish the players would at least stand still when I'm not moving them. 10-Yard Fight is a bit better. You can choose from 5 difficulty levels: high school, college, professional, playoff, or Super Bowl. Always play the easiest because I pretty much stink at these games. After the ball is kicked off, you and 8 defenders try to advance as far as possible. I was actually able to get a touchdown a couple of times doing this, at least on the high school mode. Selecting plays seems to be non-existent. Once the ball is snapped, you can run it or throw it to a teammate that follows the same paths every time. This is definitely a case where the NES game is more enjoyable. Certainly the ability to play alone is a benefit, as is the slightly more complex gameplay. Hey, at least the 2600 game has multiple plays where the NES doesn't. Golf. You know, a lot of people hate on the Atari 2600 version of golf, and I can understand why. It's a little confusing how you're supposed to hit the ball. But after some practice, you begin to learn where to stand and how to make the ball go where you want it. Of course, you might still swing too hard or too lightly, but that also improves with practice. The NES game is honestly not that much different from the Atari game. Yeah, it looks better, and you get to choose different clubs, but the inaccurate aiming and hit power is just as problematic. Unfortunately, the course doesn't zoom in on either game until you get to the green. There's some fun to be had in both of these games if you look for it, but neither of them give you a true golfing experience. If only we had Craig Statler in these games.
Just forget this hole and go on to the next one.
Gyruss. Shoot spaceships in a circular pattern. Get the awesome double blaster power-up. Listen to amazing classical music while traveling to the planets of the solar system. I mean, what's not to love about this game? The Atari 2600 version is a decent representation of the original. I was really surprised how much it plays like it. And the music is even pretty good. Sometimes. The Nintendo port took that original game and expanded on it. The premise and gameplay are basically the same, but with the added bonus of battling some interesting looking bosses. There's also new enemies to contend with, which keeps the game from getting stale. This one is one of my favorite NES games of all time. The Atari version has the same basic gameplay as the original arcade, but the NES version, whoa, gameplay advantage NES. Home Run versus Baseball. Oof, this is rough. Home Run is an extremely stripped down baseball game, if you can even call it that. Games 1 through 4 are single player and 5 through 8 are 2-player. Perfect for me since I have no friends. Each game has a different number of defenders, 1, 2, 3, or 3 spread out. Pitch the ball by holding the joystick in a direction and pressing the fire button. Swing the bat by moving the joystick at just the right time. Defense just has to grab the ball and touch the runner. That's it. Very simple. The NES game definitely looks better. No contest there. It also has more than sounds of your runner. It's not really realistic, but, it's something. This one also has more gameplay elements to it, like being able to catch and throw the ball, as well as the ability to try to pick off base runners. Yeah, the NES game isn't perfect, but it makes Home Run look like a Pee-wee team compared to an MLB club. Yikes. Huge gameplay advantage to the NES. Ikari Warriors. We all know this game by now, right? It's kind of a Commando ripoff, only with more weapons and vehicles to drive. Obviously, the Atari version is very limited, but it's also extremely difficult. But you do get to drive the tank and shoot enemies like soldiers, other tanks, and helicopters. Launching the grenade is tricky because you have to hold down the fire button. I really wasn't able to get too far into the game, and that's probably a good thing since this stage just repeats over and over again anyway. Also, I think I heard there's continues in this game, but I'm not really sure. Let me know down in the comments. On Nintendo, the gameplay is improved because of the speed. Plus, I'm able to last much longer in the tank, probably because there's plenty of gas to keep it going. Oh, and there's other weapons in the game too. Not to mention a helicopter that you can fly. That was fun. Of course, I wouldn't have gotten very far without that ABBA code. Thank you, AVGN, for putting that into my head forever. Like the Atari game, this one just never ends. Well, at least seemingly. I like both of these games, but clearly the NES version has a huge gameplay advantage over the Atari. Joust. Can I describe this game in 20 words or less? Let's give it a shot. Fly an ostrich, land on enemies, and collect the eggs before they hatch, spawning more enemies. Avoid the invincible pterodactyl. Let's see, that's 1, 2, 3... 20 words exactly! Yes! Okay, so the 2600 version of Joust is amazing. It really plays a lot like the arcade with one caveat. The eggs never land. I'm thinking it's a limitation of the hardware keeping multiple sprites off the same scan lines, but I could be wrong. I don't know how this hardware works. All I know is that this is an absolutely fantastic version of the classic arcade game. Now the NES game, well, it definitely looks the part, and it does play pretty well, but I don't know, it just feels off somehow. Like the animation just feels choppy for some reason. Sounds are adequate and very similar to the arcade. Fortunately, the eggs do land, but does that make the gameplay better? Ultimately, I feel that the 2600 game is more fun in the gameplay department. There's just something odd about the NES version that I can't quite put my finger on that doesn't exist in the 2600 game. Kung Fu Master and Kung Fu. Your girlfriend has been kidnapped. Oh no. And you must fight your way through this 5-story mansion to save her. Enemies will come at you from both directions and you only have your fists and your feet to attack with. The 2600 game is pretty incredible in all departments. Graphics, sounds, and gameplay. It plays very much like the original arcade game, but actually I was told by Dan Kitchen himself that it was modeled after the NES, but, you know, that's not a bad thing. The NES version is one of the original black box games. The graphics are not really pushing the hardware very hard, but they're still very nice. The game also plays like the arcade, and you have the same kicks, punches, enemies, and sound effects. Both games are really fun, and the Atari game is a marvel of programming. Ultimately, though, neither have a gameplay advantage over the other in the gameplay department. Sorry, Nintendo fans. Mario Brothers. I remember when I got this game, I thought to myself, cool, I can play Mario Brothers on my Atari. And that I sure did, because I played the 2600 version of Mario Brothers far more than the original arcade game. It really is incredible how good this version is. All the enemies and gameplay elements are here, making this game a ton of fun. Oh, and Mario moves very fast and smoothly about the screen, which is very, very nice. Now, the Nintendo game looks more like the arcade, but does it play all that much better? Well, not really. Mario still has to bop the enemies from below and knock them off the platform. The shell creepers, crabs, fighter flies, icemen, fireballs, coins, and the POW are all here, just like in the 2600 game. So gameplay-wise, these two games are very close. The 2600 version is a little stiffer, but that doesn't hurt the game at all. To me, this one is a tie. Millipede. Shoot the millipede, and the spider, and, the mosquitoes. Ugh, I hate those guys. This is one frantic game ramping up from the earlier centipede. DDT pods appear and can be destroyed, releasing a cloud of poison to destroy the bugs. Blast the inchworm to slow things down, and the ladybug to advance the screen downward. Also beware of bug waves of bees and those terrible mosquitoes. Ugh. Gameplay on the NES is very good. It has all the same elements of the 2600 version, but it just doesn't feel as crazy and frantic as the Atari game. It's slower, and there's just much less going on at once. I actually feel like I might have a chance here, which is never a good thing with these games. Hopefully it gets a lot faster in the later levels. Both are good fun, but in my opinion, the 2600 game has better and faster gameplay. Pac-Man. Oof, this one won't be hard. Okay, so we all know the 2600 Pac-Man game doesn't look or sound at all like the arcade game. But does it play like the arcade game? No, it doesn't. Sure, you're still being chased by ghosts in a maze and eating dots and power pellets to turn the tables. But it really does not feel like Pac-Man. Does it make that a bad game? Not really, but it's just not like the original arcade. On Nintendo, this game is practically perfect. The graphics are a little lacking in the detail and color department, but that doesn't affect the gameplay. You still get that same satisfaction when eating the ghosts. There's no question the NES game plays better, or at least more like the original arcade game. Pitfall 2 versus Super Pitfall. Pitfall 2 is the sequel to the original classic Pitfall game. That game was so popular that it spawned a cartoon series that featured Harry's niece Rhonda and their pet puma named Quick-Claw.
Nice work, old buddy. Couldn't have done it without you. All in a day's work.
And it's a day the shark will never forget.
So when the sequel was being created, David Crane added those characters into the game. I find that to be pretty cool. Anyway, Pitfall is a truly amazing game where you search for treasure in a deep, dark cave. My favorite effect is when you're swimming in the water. That just looks so cool. Oh, and when I interviewed David, he was especially proud of the adaptive music, which is incredible. Okay, so what did the Nintendo have? Super Pitfall. You know, I was actually excited for this game when it was released. I thought to myself, wow, Nintendo players will finally understand why Atari fans love Pitfall so much. And then I played it. Boy, is it awful. Never mind the glitchy graphics, the controls are just terrible and the cavern is extremely confusing. But hey, you know, at least Harry jumps 20 feet into the air. That's gotta count for something, right? Yeah, in this case, the 2600 beats the NES hands down. Pitfall 2 is a classic. Super Pitfall sucks. Popeye. I remember playing this one a bunch at Super Skates in Winter Haven, Florida. It was a tabletop, and I was really wowed by the cartoony graphics. Later, I got the Atari 8-bit computer version and played the heck out of it. But I never did play the 2600 game until recently, and I gotta say, it's not too bad. Stage 2's layout is off, but I'm sure that's to work within the system's limitations. Also, there's no barrel on Stage 1, which isn't too great of a loss. Fortunately, Stage 3 looks very much like the original. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. The Nintendo version plays pretty much identical to the arcade. Popeye's punch distance is a bit further than in the Atari game. The character animation is nice and smooth, and going up and down the stairs is a little easier, that's for sure. But graphics and sounds aren't really enough to declare the NES the winner here. Both games, I'm sorry NES fans, play pretty much the same. Q*bert. Imagine if the game didn't have Q*bert changing the block colors. How would you make this game fun? That's what Warren Davis was up against when he created it. Then his gruff boss came up with the idea to change the block colors, and boom, a classic was born. Despite the graphics, the Atari game is very similar to the arcade. Q*bert still hops on the cubes and changes their colors, and you have to avoid the enemies. It's actually a pretty good port of the arcade game. How about the NES game? Yep, it looks more like the arcade. In fact, it's practically identical. Thankfully, this isn't a beauty contest, it's a gameplay contest. And the NES game plays great, just like the arcade. The ability to customize the controls before the game starts is also very nice. Both games play just like Q*bert. You're still hopping on the cubes, changing the colors, so this is a tie. Rampage. What happens when you turn into a giant monster? Do you sit around eating giant Cheetos? Or maybe rescue kittens out of trees? Nope. You get really angry and start smashing things. Or at least that's what this game has taught me anyways. The 2600 version of this popular arcade game is better than you think. Check out the detailed backgrounds. There's actually a cityscape back there, and helicopters flying past in silhouette. That's pretty cool. There's also cars on the road and trains on the tracks to smash up. I do wish the building's graphics were more detailed, but what are you gonna do? Gameplay is just as repetitive as the original arcade game. So what's different about the NES games in terms of gameplay? I mean, you're still climbing buildings and smashing them. There's more enemies to avoid though. Oh, and more bullets, and tanks, and there's more people and stuff in the buildings to eat and attack. In both games, you smash buildings, eat people, and avoid getting hit by bullets. Very repetitive, even though one game has better visuals and sounds. This is a tie. Roadrunner. I loved watching Bugs Bunny and the Roadrunner on Saturday mornings when I was a kid, and I was surprised to learn much later that Atari Games created an arcade game based on that cartoon. The 2600 version has you play as the Roadrunner himself, who is trying to escape being eaten by the perpetually hungry Wile E. Coyote. Eat birdseed along the way and try to get Wile E to step in front of a truck or get hit by a bomb. To make it through stage 3, you have to keep Wile E close, otherwise he will use a rocket to catch you. And then stage 4. I can only last about 5 seconds, dang it. The Nintendo game is similar in gameplay and difficulty. You're still running from Wile E and trying to get him to step in front of something dangerous. He also tries to use different contraptions to capture you, which keep you on your toes. Touching the sand can stop you dead in your tracks though, which can be rather frustrating. Again, these games play very similarly. Both are extremely tough, but the NES game is a bit easier. Gameplay advantage? Tie. Spy Hunter. Drive your spy mobile down the road, blasting enemy agents. The truck will give you special weapons like smoke screens and oil slicks. The enemies are relentless, but so are the regular cars. They're quite annoying, so I just started shooting them too. My favorite part of the game is when you get to drive the boat. I wish we had a whole game like this. The NES game is pretty cool. It has all the same gameplay elements of the Atari game, but the controls are a lot more slippery. You're more likely to run off the road here. Getting to the boat is not as guaranteed though, because you have to stay to the left to enter the boathouse. Both games are fun and offer these same gameplay elements, but the Atari game has slightly better controls. Star Raiders versus Star Voyager. Star Raiders is by far the killer app for the Atari 8-bit computer. That's where I played it the most, and it's absolutely incredible. So I've never really played the 2600 game very much except for this video, and I gotta say, it's pretty dang good. It's a lot more action-oriented than the computer game, though. You basically just shoot all the enemies, not worrying too much about traveling to the different sectors. When your ship gets hit, it starts acting all busted up, too. That's pretty cool. Star Voyager really takes that sector hopping thing seriously. I spent most of my playtime just trying to get to the enemies. And when I finally did get to battle those enemy ships, they took me out very quickly. This is a very complex game that I'm sure some people find very enjoyable. But to me, the simple gameplay action of Star Raiders for the 2600 is far superior to Star Voyager. Tennis. Such a simple game. Just hit the ball over the net, keep it in bounds, and don't let it bounce more than once. It's easier said than done, though, because the computer is brutal in the 2600 game. I don't think I even scored a point. There is a slower mode, and you can adjust the difficulty switches to hit the ball at wider angles, but nothing really makes the computer play a little friendlier. Fortunately, you don't have to press a button to swing your racket. Just get close to the ball. As you would expect, tennis on the NES has the same basic gameplay as the Atari game. You're still hitting the ball over the net and keeping it in bounds. It's just more fun because the computer actually gives you a chance. Controlling the direction of a hit ball is nearly impossible. I mean, I know where I want it to go, it just doesn't go that way. Pressing the button to swing means you have to have your timing down perfectly. The Nintendo game is more fun, but the 2600 game doesn't require you to press the button in order to hit the ball. Either way, these games play pretty much the same, so it's a tie. Track and field. Remember pounding the heck out of that arcade cabinet? I can only imagine how worried the arcade owner was when seeing all that abuse that it would take. Poor guy. The 2600 port is a little hard to come by, but if you can find it, you can play it with your joystick or with the special track and field controller. There are 6 events: 100-meter dash, long jump, javelin, 110-meter hurdles, hammer throw, and the dreaded high jump. Pretty much every event's gameplay consists of move the joystick left and right as fast as possible and press the button at the exact right time. That's really all there is. On the NES, we're missing the hammer throw, but we do have skeet shooting, triple jump, and archery from the Hyper Sports arcade game. Of course, that makes the NES game better because it has more events. But are the 5 comparable events better than the 2600 versions? Not really. The big difference is how you run or jump. Pressing A runs, and pressing the joypad jumps, which is a bit different than most versions of the game. For some reason, the B button isn't used at all. Why is that? Like I said, the NES game is better and more fun, but the comparable events play pretty much the same. Trick shot versus side pocket. Fairly accurate ball physics for the 2600? That's incredible! There's trick shot mode, pool, English billiards, and trick shot practice. Trick shot has you advancing through 9 different ball arrangements that you have to sink in one shot. Pool is a little limited though. You only have 3 balls to sink, but you have to do it 5 times. Moving the little dot around the ball represents the impact point of your cue stick. Holding the button down longer will hit the ball harder, and moving the joystick before you release the button will add English to the shot. The only problem is that there's no indicator as to how hard you're going to hit the ball or how the English is applied. Over on the NES we have side pocket. It also has some really nice ball physics, but unfortunately only one mode where you try to sink all the balls. In this one, you can actually see how hard you're going to hit the ball and what kind of English you're adding. That's really nice. Not to mention a representation of the direction your ball will travel once you hit it. Also, there's more than 3 balls on the table at once. The aiming in side pocket is the biggest gameplay advantage it has. Trick shot still plays a good game of pool, but the aiming and lack of indicators really hurt it. Gameplay advantage, NES. Video pinball versus pinball. I'm an unabashed fan of Atari's video pinball. I used to play this one for hours. Sure, I knew it wasn't like real pinball, but I didn't care. I wanted to get that square ball to go through the rollers over and over again to increase my score. It's kind of lame to look at, but I really enjoyed this game. Now let's look at Nintendo's pinball game. There are some good gameplay elements here. There's lots of targets to shoot for, and the ball physics are decent. I like that it has multiple stages to keep things interesting. Although I'm not really sure what's going on with the birds and the playing cards theme, though. So which one has better gameplay? Well, the 2600 game is faster, and it's always been a favorite. But the Nintendo game plays more like actual pinball, even though I find it kind of boring. So I like the gameplay on the 2600 game better. Xenophobe. Wow, so many games that were inspired by the movie Aliens. I love it. This one has you infiltrating a base, cleaning out those alien creatures with different weapons, bombs, lasers, and such. There's quite a few different forms of the aliens, too. There's the big alien-esque creature, the small face-hugger pod things, tentacles that hang from the ceiling, roller blobs, and other critters. The Atari game doesn't have a 2-player simultaneous mode, which pretty much sucks, because the bottom part of the screen is where player 2 is anyway. Dang. Fortunately, the gameplay is great and the controls actually make sense. Push down to crawl, push up to jump, press fire to shoot, etc. The Nintendo game's colors are absolutely terrible. I feel sick just looking at it. It's nice that you have 3 characters to choose from even though they all play exactly the same. Shooting aliens with your pea shooter really stinks, and trying to get better weapons is rare. Thankfully, this one does have the 2-player simultaneous mode, which I'm sure would be very enjoyable with a friend. But what really lets this game down are the controls. They just don't make any sense to me. You have to press the A button to duck, grab an item, or to activate a teleporter. Yeah, that's probably more accurate to the arcade, but it makes it confusing for me. What do you want? I'm an old man. Both of these games play essentially the same, but in my opinion, the 2600 game is better thanks to the controls. The missing 2-player simultaneous thing definitely sucks though. Okay, well, there you have it. 33 games between the 2 titans of 8-bit. Which ones did I get right and which ones did I get wrong? Please let me know down in the comments. Until then, I want to thank you for watching. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.